Why did the employee who kept the entire business alive finally snap? My bosses called me the problem guy. Not because I liked solving problems, though I was good at it, but because I could fix any error in the spaghetti code that was our system and single-handedly kept our entire startup alive. The whole thing started when I answered a Craigslist ad my senior year. Need someone who codes was literally all it said. No requirements, just someone who could write basic JavaScript. The interview was in a garage with 3 Stanford MBAs who'd had an idea for revolutionizing peer-to-peer marketplace transactions, but had burned through 5 developers who kept quitting. Their code base was a nightmare. React mixed with jQuery, no documentation, variable names like thing1 and stuff new, final 2. The previous developers had rage quit, leaving behind digital chaos. Can you fix this? Brad, the CEO, asked, showing me an error screen that had been crashing their site every 3 hours for a month. I fixed it in 40 minutes. They hired me on the spot. The first 6 months were actually beautiful. When I prevented our first major crash during an investor demo, they took me out for Korean BBQ. Brad raised a toast to Daniel, the real MVP. Without him, we'd be nothing. Jessica, the CFO, literally cried when I recovered 3 months of data they thought was lost. Mike, the CTO who couldn't actually code, called me a genius in front of everyone. Word spread through the company that I could fix anything. Sales would text me directly when clients complained. Marketing would beg me to just quickly look at the analytics integration. Customer service had my personal cell for emergencies. I became the secret weapon they'd whisper about to investors. We have this guy who can solve literally any technical problem. By year 2, I was doing the work of an entire engineering team. My 40-hour weeks became 60, then 80, then 90. I'd deploy patches at 3 a.m. while Brad posted Instagram stories from Burning Man. I debugged critical features during Thanksgiving while they flew to Turkey for a leadership retreat. I lived on energy drinks and gas station sushi, fixing problems for my phone at family gatherings. They kept me going with promises. Once we closed Series A, you're getting equity, man. You're employee number 4. You'll be rich. That became after Series B for sure. Then right before the C round, I promised. I believed them because I was 24 and stupid and thought hard work meant something. The equity promises became a running joke I wasn't in on. They'd introduce me to investors as Daniel, our little helper from community college, then frantically text me when the live demo crashed. At company parties, they'd tell the story of finding me like I was a stray dog they'd rescued. We gave him his first real job, Jessica would say, wine drunk and condescending. He didn't even go to a real school, but the moment something broke, my phone would explode. Emergency, Daniel, please, the site is down. Fixing it is your only priority. I remember the exact moment everything changed. We were filing for IPO, and I asked Brad about my equity over Slack. He responded with a laughing emoji. You were never technically an employee, Daniel. You're a contractor. No equity for contractors. That's standard. The next day, they announced the IPO at an all-hands meeting. The company was valued at $500 million. My theoretical 1%, what they'd been promising for 3 years, would have been worth $5 million. Instead, they gave me a $500 bonus and threw a pizza party. Brad made a speech about how everyone contributed to our success while looking directly through me. That night, I opened my laptop and looked at the code I'd maintained for 3 years. Every function, every module, every critical system had my fingerprints on it, including the little time bombs I'd planted over the years. Not malicious, just insurance. Dead man switches I'd built during those 3 a.m. Debugging sessions commented with innocuous notes that looked like regular error handling. The NYSE opening bell ceremony was perfect. CNBC was there. TechCrunch had a live blog. Brad's parents flew in from Connecticut. He rang the bell at 9:30 a.m. Confetti fell. Champagne popped. The stock opened at $47. At 9:31, every function in our code base simultaneously returned the same error. Equity not found. The site didn't just crash. It displayed that message on every page, every app screen, every API response. The stock price started dropping immediately. Investors panicked. The technical team, the new one they'd hired with real degrees, couldn't figure it out. They called me 17 times. I didn't answer. By market close, we'd lost $50 million in valuation. Brad was screaming on Bloomberg about cyber terrorism and sabotage. The board launched an investigation. That's when I sent the screenshots to every major tech journalist. 3 years of Slack messages. Just keep the code monkey thinking he'll get equity until IPO. Daniel actually thinks he's getting shares. He fixes everything for basically nothing. It's incredible. Thank God he's too stupid to know his worth. But my favorite was from Brad to Mike. I told him next quarter again. Bought us 3 more months of free labor. He's from community college. What's he going to do? Sue us? I closed my laptop and waited. They knew where I lived. This was about about to be fun. 3 sharp knocks hit my door at 2 p.m., and my whole body went cold. Through the peephole, I saw a guy in a bad suit holding a thick envelope, and I knew exactly what this was. I opened the door and he asked if I was Daniel, then handed me the papers without any drama. The stack was heavy in my hands, maybe 50 pages thick. I signed his little electronic pad and he left without saying anything else. Back inside, my hands shook as I flipped through the lawsuit. Breach of contract, computer fraud, trade secret theft, and they wanted $50 million in damages. $50 million from a guy living in a 1-bedroom apartment eating ramen most nights. The legal words blurred together, but I caught phrases like malicious intent and coordinated attack and irreparable harm to shareholders. My laptop was still open from earlier, so I started searching for lawyers who knew about tech cases and CFAA charges. Most firms wanted $5,000 just for a consultation. I left voicemails at 3 places explaining my situation, trying to sound calm while my voice cracked. Within an hour, Conrad Donovan's office called me back. His assistant said he'd read about the IPO crash and could see me tomorrow morning at 9. I spent the whole night organizing everything, printing emails, making copies of code commits, creating timelines of every broken promise. My printer ran out of ink twice, and I had to run to the 24-hour CVS at midnight. The next morning, I showed up at Conrad's office with 2 banker's boxes full of documents. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, wearing jeans and a button-down instead of a suit. I laid everything out on his conference table, the 3 years of false promises, the screenshots, the code I'd written with my little insurance policies buried inside. He took notes on a yellow legal pad, asking me to explain technical stuff in simple terms. When I showed him the Slack messages about keeping the code monkey working for free, his eyebrows went up, but he didn't say anything. After 2 hours of going through everything, Conrad leaned back and told me the real problem. The civil lawsuit was bad, but survivable. The criminal charges under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act could put me in actual prison. The FBI might get involved if Brad pushed hard enough with his cyber terrorism claims. I could face 5 to 10 years if they proved I intentionally caused damage over $5,000, which losing $50 million in market value definitely qualified for. My phone buzzed while Conrad was explaining prison sentences, and I saw Angelica Crow's name on the screen. The TechCrunch reporter wanted to verify the Slack screenshots were real. She needed me to explain the metadata and prove I hadn't faked anything. Conrad nodded that I should take the call. Angelica was all business, asking about timestamps and email headers, and how I'd preserve the chain of custody for the evidence. We set up a video call for that afternoon. The call with Angelica lasted 3 hours, and she grilled me on every single detail. She screen shared while I walked her through the Slack export files, showing her the message IDs and server timestamps that proved they were real. She asked about specific conversations, made me explain technical details about our codebase, wanted to know exact dates and times for everything. Her skepticism actually made me feel better because it meant she was taking this seriously, not just running with a juicy story. She asked about the insurance policies in the code, and I explained how they were just error handlers that would trigger under specific conditions, nothing actually malicious. After the call, Conrad's warnings about evidence preservation hit me hard. If the FBI got involved, they'd want every device I owned, every backup, every scrap of digital evidence. I spent the entire night creating encrypted copies of everything, backing up to external drives, uploading to secure cloud storage, documenting every single step I took. I changed all my passwords, enabled 2-factor on everything, even created a new email account just for legal stuff. My paranoia went into overdrive, and I started checking my apartment for bugs, taping over my laptop camera, using a VPN for everything. The next morning, the company released their public statement, and my phone exploded with notifications. They called me a rogue contractor who held our systems hostage for personal gain and claimed they'd offered me fair compensation that I'd rejected out of greed. They said I'd committed cyber terrorism and put thousands of jobs at risk with my malicious attack. My LinkedIn inbox. They said I'd committed cyber terrorism and put thousands of jobs at risk with my malicious attack. My LinkedIn inbox filled with angry messages from people calling me a criminal, saying I should be in jail, threatening to make sure I never worked in tech again. Former coworkers who'd been friendly suddenly blocked me on everything. Recruiters who'd been eager to talk last week stopped returning my emails. One startup that was about to make me an offer called to say they were going in a different direction, and I knew my name was poison now. Brad had won this round, and my career in Silicon Valley was basically over before it started. 3 more recruiters who'd been super interested in me just last week stopped answering my emails completely. I'd been talking to this one startup about a senior dev position, and they'd basically told me the job was mine. But when I called to follow up, the HR person said they were going in a different direction. She sounded uncomfortable on the phone and hung up fast. I checked my LinkedIn and saw that 12 people had viewed my profile in the last hour, all from tech companies in the area. My reputation was getting destroyed in real time. Conrad called me that afternoon and said we needed to meet again immediately. I drove to his office, and he sat me down with this serious look on his face. He explained that the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was no joke, and the FBI had put people in federal prison for way less than what I'd done. He made it super clear that I couldn't touch their systems anymore, couldn't run any diagnostic tools, couldn't even ping their servers to check if they were up. Any digital contact at all could be seen as more hacking and would make everything worse. He actually made me write down a list of every way I might accidentally access their stuff, and then told me to avoid all of it. 2 days later, a FedEx truck pulled up, and the driver handed me an envelope that required a signature. Inside was a demand letter from M. Young at Whitman & Associates, the big law firm the company used. The letter was 8 pages long and threatened civil litigation for damages exceeding $50 million, criminal referral to the FBI for violations of the CFAA, and claimed they had evidence I'd been planning this attack for months. They gave me 5 business days to respond, or they'd file everything with the court. My hands were shaking as I scanned the pages and sent them to Conrad. He called me back within 10 minutes and told me not to panic, that this was standard intimidation stuff, but we needed to start building our defense immediately. I spent the next 3 days going through every email, every text, every Slack message from the last 3 years. I found my old notebooks where I tracked my hours, because I'm the kind of person who writes everything down. The logs showed 80 to 90-hour weeks consistently, sometimes more during product launches. I had receipts for energy drinks bought at 3 a.m. while fixing their servers, screenshots of me working on Christmas Day, proof of me missing family events to handle their emergencies. Conrad looked at all of it and started calculating what they actually owed me in unpaid overtime. The number was huge, way more than I'd expected. He said this could be useful for a counterclaim and started drafting something about wage theft. 4 days after the demand letter arrived, my phone started blowing up with notifications. Angelica's article had gone live on TechCrunch with the headline, IPO, Disaster Exposes Years of Startup Labor Exploitation. She'd included some of the screenshots I'd sent her, but had redacted names and specific details to protect me from defamation claims. The article laid out the whole story of how they'd strung me along with equity promises while treating me like garbage. She'd even found other sources who confirmed the company's pattern of behavior. Within an hour, the article had thousands of shares and hundreds of comments from people sharing their own similar experiences. My inbox exploded with messages from former startup employees telling me their stories. One guy who'd worked there before me sent a detailed email about how Brad had promised him equity too, then fired him right before vesting would have started. He offered to provide a written statement for my case. Another person sent screenshots of Brad making the same promises to other contractors over the years. Someone else forwarded me an email where Jessica had bragged about keeping labor costs down by using contractors who thought they'd get equity. The evidence was piling up that this wasn't just about me, it was their whole business model. That same afternoon, Conrad got an email from the company's lawyers with a preservation notice. They demanded I maintain all devices, all data, all backups for discovery. I couldn't delete anything, couldn't wipe any drives, couldn't even clear my browser history. Conrad told me to comply immediately and document everything I preserved. I went to Best Buy that day and bought a new laptop for daily use so my old one would stay exactly as it was. I put the old laptop in a box with all my external drives and labeled everything with dates. I even took photos of each device and its serial number. The company didn't waste any time firing back at the article. They filed a defamation claim against me and Angelica, saying we'd published false and malicious content intended to harm their business. Conrad wasn't worried, though. He started preparing something called an anti-slap motion, which he explained was designed to protect people from lawsuits meant to silence them. He said that since everything in the article was true and backed by evidence, they didn't have a real case. The defamation claim was just meant to scare us and drain our resources with legal fees. My mom called me crying the next morning because she'd read about the potential criminal charges online. She kept asking if I was going to jail, and I couldn't give her a straight answer because I honestly didn't know. My dad got on the phone and told me I should just apologize, give them what they want, make this whole thing go away. He didn't understand that it was way past that point. I felt terrible for dragging my family into this mess. They didn't deserve the stress and worry. Later that day, Angelica texted me with huge news. One of the company's major investors was reconsidering their position after reading the article and seeing the public reaction. The investor was worried about the reputational damage and potential legal liability. She'd heard from insider sources that the board had called an emergency meeting, and Brad was under serious pressure to explain how this had happened. The stock price had dropped another 10% since the article went live. Things were moving fast, and I had no idea where they would end up. My LinkedIn notification pinged while I was eating cereal the next morning, and there was a message from someone named Lucas Mills who ran engineering at a different startup. He'd read Angelica's article and wanted to grab coffee to talk about a possible contract gig, but he was super clear that he needed to understand my whole situation first before anything could happen. I screenshot the message and sent it to Conrad, who told me it was fine to meet as long as I didn't sign anything or make commitments without running it by him first. Conrad and I spent that afternoon going through all my old emails and Slack messages to build a case for the SEC about how Brad and the team had lied to investors about their tech capabilities. We found presentations where they claimed to have a 12-person engineering team when really it was just me and 2 junior developers who barely lasted 6 months each. The documentation showed they'd raised $40 million based on tech infrastructure that was basically held together by my late-night patches and energy drink-fueled debugging sessions. Conrad helped me file the whistleblower complaint online and explained that if the SEC found violations, I could get a percentage of any fines they collected, which might actually be serious money. 2 days later, Conrad forwarded me a letter from M. Young at their law firm, suggesting we should discuss what she called a mutually beneficial resolution. She wrote that they'd be willing to provide immunity from prosecution if I helped fix the system, but Conrad immediately called it a trap designed to get me to admit I'd done something illegal by accessing their systems. He told me not to respond and let him handle all communication with their lawyers from now on, which was fine by me since reading legal threats was making my anxiety worse. While Conrad was dealing with that, I started digging through my old paperwork and found my original contractor agreement buried in my Gmail from 3 years ago. The thing was full of arbitration clauses and broad IP assignment language that basically said anything I created while working for them belonged to the company forever. I forwarded it to Conrad expecting bad news, but he actually laughed and said this was great because arbitration meant they couldn't drag me through public court and destroy my reputation with a big trial. The coffee meeting with Lucas happened at a Starbucks downtown, and he showed up wearing jeans and a hoodie, which immediately made me feel better than if he'd been in a suit. He asked me technical questions about my actual work, like what frameworks I knew and how I'd handle certain scaling problems, and he actually understood the answers, unlike Mike, who just nodded and pretended. Lucas explained his team was building something in fintech and needed someone who could audit their security setup, and he was super clear that everything would need proper documentation and clear boundaries with set hours and immediate certain scaling problems, and he actually understood the answers, unlike Mike, who just nodded and pretended. Lucas explained his team was building something in fintech and needed someone who could audit their security setup, and he was super clear that everything would need proper documentation and clear boundaries with set hours and immediate payment for all work. He said he'd send over a formal offer in a few days after talking to his board, but he seemed genuinely interested in my skills, not just the drama. I was walking back to my apartment feeling decent for the first time in weeks when I saw a news van parked outside my building with a reporter and camera guy standing by the entrance. My neighbor, Mrs. Chang, was out there pointing at my window and telling them all about how I was such a quiet young man who kept strange hours, and she couldn't believe I was involved in destroying a company. I turned around and went straight to a coffee shop to call Conrad, who immediately sent the news crew a cease and desist letter threatening legal action if they aired any footage of my apartment or tried to contact me again. That same evening, Angelica texted asking if I could connect her with other contractors who'd been screwed over for a follow-up piece about exploitation in tech startups. I gave her a few names and emails from people who'd reached out to me after her article, but I was careful to tell them to check with their own lawyers before talking to any journalists. Conrad had been trying to set up a meeting with the DA's office about the criminal hacking threats and finally got a sit-down with a prosecutor who reviewed the whole case. After an hour of going through the evidence, the prosecutor told Conrad this looked like a civil dispute between an employer and contractor, not criminal hacking, since I'd had authorized access to all the systems when I'd put in my code. Conrad called me immediately after the meeting, practically shouting with relief that the prosecutor wasn't interested in pursuing charges, which meant I probably wasn't going to jail. The relief lasted about 12 hours before Conrad got an emergency filing notification that the company was requesting a temporary restraining order to stop me from making any more disclosures about their business. The hearing was set for next week, and Conrad started preparing our defense based on First Amendment protections and the fact that everything I'd shared was true and in the public interest. He said judges usually didn't like these kinds of gag orders when there was clear evidence of corporate wrongdoing, but we'd have to show up and argue our case. Things got really bad when someone posted my home address on a tech forum with a thread titled, Here's where the guy who crashed the IPO lives. And within hours, I started getting pizza deliveries I didn't order. Then came the phone calls to my landlord saying I was running a drug operation, and someone even sent a funeral wreath to my door with a card that said, "Rip your career," which honestly was more sad than scary. Conrad documented everything for our counterclaims about harassment and told me I should probably stay somewhere else for a few days. So I crashed at my friend's place across town and tried to keep a low profile while this whole mess played out. 2 days later, Conrad forwarded me an email from Mei Jung with a settlement offer attached in a PDF that made me laugh out loud when I opened it on my friend's laptop. $50,000 and a complete NDA plus non-disparagement clause that basically meant I could never talk about anything that happened ever again. Conrad called me right after I finished reading it, and I could hear him chuckling before he even said anything about how we should counter at 10 times that amount, given how much trouble they were in with the SEC and their investors. I started drafting our counter while refreshing tech news sites, and that's when I saw the headline on TechCrunch about Brad being placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation by the board. The article said Mike had been named interim CEO, which made me actually snort coffee through my nose since the guy couldn't write a single line of code and once asked me if JavaScript and Java were the same thing. My phone buzzed with a LinkedIn message from Lucas, who'd been following the whole mess and wanted to formally offer me a 3-month contract for security auditing with really clear boundaries and scope. The paperwork he sent over was clean and simple with hourly rates spelled out, and no mention of equity or changing the world or any of that startup nonsense that had gotten me into this mess in the first place. The TTRO hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, and Conrad spent 3 hours prepping me on what to expect and how to answer questions if the judge asked me anything directly. We drove to the courthouse together, and I wore my only suit that I'd bought for my cousin's wedding 2 years ago and tried not to fidget while we waited outside the courtroom. The judge was this older woman who looked really tired and kept checking her watch, while the company's lawyers argued that I was a dangerous hacker who needed to be stopped from destroying their business. Conrad stood up and explained that I hadn't accessed any systems since leaving and had only shared truthful information with journalists, which was protected speech under the First Amendment. After 45 minutes of back and forth, the judge narrowed the restrictions way down so I couldn't access their systems, which I wasn't planning to do anyway, but I could still talk to journalists and regulators about what happened. 3 days after the hearing, Conrad got another email from May saying they were ready for serious mediation if I would provide documentation on how to fix the system that was still showing error messages randomly. Conrad wrote back that any technical assistance would require full immunity from prosecution and significant compensation for my time and expertise. They went back and forth for a week with emails and phone calls until finally scheduling mediation at some neutral law firm downtown for the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend organizing all my documentation, including 3 years of time-stamped logs showing every time I'd warned them about system problems and gotten ignored or told I was being dramatic. Tuesday morning, I put on my suit again and met Conrad in the lobby of this fancy building, where the law firm had offices on the 20th floor with views of the whole bay. We took the elevator up and walked into a conference room where May was already sitting with some older guy in an expensive suit who turned out to be from the board, plus their whole technical team who looked really uncomfortable. I opened my laptop and connected it to the projector, then started showing slide after slide of emails and Slack messages where I'd warned them about exactly the problems that were happening now. The board guy's face went completely white when he saw the message from Brad, dismissing my concerns about system fragility as just me being dramatic again and trying to seem important. May cleared her throat and acknowledged that there had been damage to both sides' reputations, then floated a settlement number in the mid-6 figures while pushing a stack of papers across the table. She wanted a mutual non-disparagement agreement and for me to provide complete documentation on fixing the system within 48 hours of signing. I looked at Conrad, who nodded slightly, then told them I wanted full back pay for all the overtime I'd worked for 3 years, plus my legal fees, plus really narrow speech restrictions that would still let me talk about general industry practices without mentioning them specifically. Conrad added that we needed a letter stating no criminal referral would be made to the FBI or any other law enforcement agency about the supposed hacking. The room got really quiet, and the board guy whispered something to May, who shook her head and said they needed the system fixed immediately before more damage was done to their stock price. Conrad leaned forward and proposed a supervised handoff, where I would document all the fixes while their team watched and implemented them with full safe harbor protection, meaning nothing I showed them could be used against me legally. Their technical team started arguing among themselves about whether they could handle the implementation, and one of them actually said out loud that they didn't understand half of what I'd built, which made the board guy's face turn red. May jumped in quickly, saying they needed to focus on solutions, not blame, and pushed an another stack of papers across the table with numbers circled in red ink. We went back and forth for another hour with Conrad writing notes on his yellow pad, while I showed them more emails where I'd begged for proper documentation time and gotten told to just keep the site running. The board guy kept rubbing his temples and finally asked everyone except me, Conrad, and May to leave the room so we could talk real numbers. May started at 200,000, which Conrad actually laughed at before countering with 800,000 plus full immunity from any criminal charges. They went back and forth while I sat there watching the clock on the wall tick past noon, then 1 cars, then 2. My stomach was growling, but nobody wanted to break for lunch because the board guy had another meeting at 4:00. Conrad kept pushing on the criminal immunity part, while Makey kept trying to tie everything to me, fixing their broken system immediately. We finally agreed on $400,000 with really specific rules about what I could and couldn't say publicly, plus a letter saying they wouldn't push for criminal charges if I gave them 10 hours of supervised help fixing the code. Rules about what I could and couldn't say publicly, plus a letter saying they wouldn't push for criminal charges if I gave them 10 hours of supervised help fixing the code. The paperwork took another hour to write up with both lawyers going over every single word while I texted my mom that things were going okay. 2 days later, I sat in front of my computer with 3 of their engineers watching through screen share while I walked them through every function I'd built over 3 years. I showed them where the triggers were hidden and how to disable them safely without breaking the whole system. They took notes constantly and asked questions that showed they were starting to understand how bad their original code really was. I explained how I'd built backup systems on top of backup systems because nobody would give me time to do it right the first time. One engineer actually apologized for not understanding what I'd been dealing with all those years. The second day was mostly about showing them the documentation I'd created on my own time, since they never gave me any. I'd made detailed notes about every major system and why I'd built things certain ways to work around their broken foundation. Their lead engineer kept shaking his head and muttering about technical debt while I showed them function after function that was holding their whole company together. By the end of the 10 hours, they had everything they needed to run the system without me. The next morning, Angelica published her follow-up article about how the situation had been resolved without going into specific numbers or details. She focused on the bigger picture of how startups treat contractors and were included quotes from other developers who'd been through similar situations. My phone finally stopped buzzing with angry messages and interview requests. People moved on to the next tech scandal within a week. I used part of the settlement money to get a new apartment in a building with actual security and a doorman who wouldn't let random people up. The place had good locks and windows that faced a courtyard instead of the street. I bought a real desk and a decent chair, plus a couch that wasn't from a thrift store. It felt weird having nice things after 3 years of living cheap, while they promised me equity that never came. Lucas and his team turned out to be exactly what I needed after all the chaos. Every task had a clear description and timeline. Every hour got logged properly, and invoices got paid on the 15th and last day of each month like clockwork. No emergency calls at 3 in the morning, no promises of future riches, just normal contract work with normal boundaries and normal expectations. His team actually listened when I suggested improvements and gave me credit in team meetings. About a month into working with them, I heard through the tech gossip network that Brad had quietly resigned from the company. The board apparently gave him a choice between resigning or getting fired for cause after my documentation showed how badly he'd mismanaged everything. He landed at another startup as a VP of something within 2 weeks because guys like him always do. The stock price stopped falling and settled at around $30, which was still way above what it probably should have been. My parents invited me over for dinner and asked if I regretted what I did. I told them I regretted trusting Brad and believing his lies, but I didn't regret standing up for myself finally. My mom said she was proud of me for not just taking it. My dad said, next time maybe try talking to a lawyer before doing anything drastic. We agreed not to bring it up anymore and just move forward. I found a therapist who specialized in workplace trauma and started going once a week. She helped me understand how 3 years of constant emergencies and broken promises had messed with my head. Sleep came easier after a few sessions though. I still checked my locks twice before bed and kept my phone on silent. The paranoia was fading, but it took time. Conrad told me to keep everything for at least 7 years just in case. So I rented a safe deposit box at my bank. My old laptop went in there along with printed copies of every email, every Slack message, and every piece of documentation from the whole mess. The drives got wrapped in anti-static bags and sealed in plastic. Better safe than sorry. 3 months into the contract with Lucas, he asked if I wanted to extend for another 6 months with a small raise. The work wasn't exciting like the old days of solving impossible problems at 2 a.m. It was boring database stuff and API integration and code reviews, but boring felt pretty good after everything that happened. I said yes immediately. The extension came with a 10% bump, which put me at a decent hourly rate for the first time in years. My phone buzzed one morning with a text from Angelica saying she'd won some big journalism award for her series on tech labor stuff and thanking me for trusting her with the story. I typed back a quick congrats and felt weird knowing something good came from all that mess. The next week, I walked into my usual coffee place and saw Mike sitting at a corner table staring at his laptop. We both froze when our eyes met, and he grabbed his stuff and left without ordering anything. I watched him hurry out and realized I didn't feel mad anymore, just tired of the whole thing. My GitHub started showing regular commits again from the contract work, and recruiters began reaching out on LinkedIn with actual decent offers. I was careful about which ones I even responded to, and turned down anything that mentioned equity or changing the world. The therapist I'd been seeing helped me see all the red flags I'd ignored for 3 years. She had me write down a list of boundaries I wouldn't cross for any job, no matter how cool it sounded. No more emergency calls after hours unless they paid triple rate up front. No promises of future money instead of actual paychecks. No working weekends without overtime pay in writing. 6 months after the IPO mess, I looked at my bank account and saw actual savings for the first time. The legal stuff was done, and Conrad said I was clear. My sleep got better and I stopped checking the locks 3 times before bed. The startup world kept doing its thing with new kids getting burned every day, but I wasn't part of that cycle anymore. Lucas mentioned during our weekly check-in that his team was growing and asked if I knew any good developers. I thought about this guy from an online support group for contractors who'd been screwed over and sent his resume along. Felt good to help someone else avoid the trap I fell into. I finally updated my LinkedIn to say senior security consultant and deleted any mention of Brad's company. Everything from those 3 years sat in a metal box at the bank, but my future was mine to figure out. That night, I pushed a client update that wrapped up at 9 instead of 3 in the morning. My phone sat on silent mode and my door stayed locked. I got into bed at a normal hour, and for the first time in years, I fell asleep without seeing error messages behind my eyelids or dreaming about servers crashing.